the reason why I think Tschumi is not a deconstructivist but a situationist is because the Situationists, an art group in the 50s in Paris and in France and in Belgium, they were trying to react as a group, yeah, against the idea of the rational subject. Yeah? You know? Now, even when in Kohlhaas' case there is Salvador Dali, as you know, Surrealism was not a post-modern project after the Second World War, it was one after the First World War. Yeah? So after the Second World War, a different thing occurred, and you could say it was the idea of a consuming society, yeah, that was rebuilding Paris by the idea of modernist diagram. Yeah? So the Situationists were a group that wanted to find a position against that. And so this Situationists is a group between 1955 to 1969, had members, and what their really point was, how can you make, or how can you reintroduce the idea of the adventure, yeah, the adventure in an urban center to make a formation for new forms of society, desires. And what it means is, it was not a critique of art, it was a critique of life. It was a critique of the postmodern traditional life. And you have to imagine why the 50s were such a problem for these people is because the 50s were not only a retreat back to a, 19th century idea of family, yeah? But it was also about, in architecture, the reconstruction of the Second World War based on a diagram that was already, modernist. So it was about the problem of how can you get rid of the meaningless of modern life, and it was the emergence of a new form of consumerism. Yeah? So that means they saw already that what happened is with the new, it became a kind of Americanization of life. Yeah? Now, this is interesting in certain way because in some countries in Europe, this of course was much later. But you have to imagine, Germany in the 60s was like buying, like, was like the new form of consumerism. So, in order to do that, I think they took some questions from the Surrealists on, yeah? But one of the most important thing was the idea of something what they call the détournement. Yeah? Now, détournement was, in principle, something that you already found in the collage thinking in the Surrealists before, which was a technique, but it was the idea of replacing something, or what the meaning, what something means, becomes basically reorganized into another meaning. Yeah. So that means is you take the function of something away and replace it into another function. So it was a technique, but as you see, for the Situationists, there were two kind of détournements. The one is marginal, and the other one is abusive. Now, the marginal détournement is to place an element, yeah, let's take anything, without a particular meaning, out of its context, so that it loses its enforced meaning. Yeah? For example, I take a newspaper fragment, yeah, or any kind of sentence or any kind of photography, meaning basically I take something, cut it out from its context. I mean, this is what Trump is doing. Yeah? Or that was every journalism is doing. It's just every journalism is doing. You take something out of a context. Yeah? Now, just to know, this is what Collage is also doing. And in the moment that you take it out of its context, suddenly you don't know anymore what the meaning is, because the meaning stays alone below that context. Yeah? But the abusive détournement is also has a certain intention, and that is, it is to place a meaningless object in such a way that it produces a new and different meaning. Yeah? So abusive détournement is therefore mostly an assemblage of marginal détournements, but turning them into abusive ones. So this became now an art practice. So the art practice was not I take something and just leave it like this. I basically take it and manipulate it and produce another effect with it. Now, here, for example, some of the stuff, here, for example, is one interesting one. And you should not say, all of these things were, of course, political arguments, yeah, because it had to do a certain way with the 68 generation. But here you can see, you suddenly take the Coca-Cola sign out of the context, yeah, produce it in relationship to the Vietnam War, and therefore you tell a story, yeah, that is actually a story that intuitively says something else. Oh, one funny one is this one. So you take the Pepsi Cola sign, it's a sign for too much sugar, you get fat, and you make then the guy over, this, yeah. Or for example, anyhow. So when Datum was one concept, which was the replacement, then they had another idea, and that was the idea of the derive, yeah. And so here comes, the derive was an idea, a concept that was of course related, yeah, to some of the, you have to not forget, Freud played enormously, Freud was in principle the reasoning, yeah, or you could say Freud was in a certain way let's say the intellectual reference, to which all postmodernism in a certain way became related to, because he wanted to replace the rational subject based on technology and so on by the irrational one. Yeah, so because all the First and the Second World War was actually a critique on technology and the idea of rationalizing that technology into a new life. And that's why Freud, who said, no, there is a kind of subconscious, psycho, blah, 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 became introduced. Yeah? And so for them, the derive was related with what they call a psychogeographic effect, and the idea was based on the idea of playing behavior. Yeah? So differently than in Kohlhaas, who wanted to produce the unforeseen event, here you could see it was the idea of a constructed event, a game, yeah, really an enforced game, yeah. But as you can see, it had to do with a particular space, and what the derive was about. Derive, I think in French, I don't know, the German translation means there was a word, I don't know, in the 19th century. Have you ever heard the idea of the flaneur? Yeah. So it became out of the drifting, it came out of the idea of the 19th century flaneur, which was basically someone who would go around the city, understand the city by just walking and giving a sensitivity or standing on relation. But what it was not the city understood as a construction of design, it was the city understood as a geographical, psychological pattern. Yeah? So it was about not the rationality of design. So that's why, for example, people produce, like especially De Boer, produced these kind of very strange maps. Now imagine these were the idea to represent, yeah, a psychogeographical geography of a place, yeah, where places, yeah, for example, are related to each other that no physical relationship have. Now, to come now to the idea that relates then to Tschumi is because there was a name for that, and that was the Naked City. Yeah? And to my knowledge, what I read is that Naked City was actually based on a movie, yeah, in Hollywood called The Naked City. Yeah? And in that Naked City, there was a murder who got hunted, yeah, by its victim, yeah? And that idea that there was a murder hunted by its victim, it became the character that Tschumi was using and later on for its Manhattan transcript, yeah? So here, for example, and just to know before we go this, here, for example, some of the psychogeographical Paris by Guy Debord. As you know, this Guy Debord then later on did some things also in Europe, but he became very important with the idea of the spectacle, yeah, and the whole idea of the spectacle of society. Of course, it was a Marxist group, totally leftist, you know, but it was the idea that there was a critique on the new form of spectacle. Even, for example, if you would read people like Pierre Vitorelli or the neo-Marxists, yeah, they would have a critique today on Zaha and all these people, yeah, as a new form of spectacle, yeah, because it actually triggers nothing else as money and blah, blah, blah. So what Du Bois now did is he traced the development of modern society in which authentic social life has been replaced with its representation, yeah? And all what was directly lived has become more represented. So here comes already the first idea that we later on see, that later on Baudrillard is going to write about, you know, if it comes to the simulacra, where postmodern life is not anymore life as life, you just live on the representation of life, yeah? And what we have today basically become the new normal, yeah, is in principle you live the life of the representation of life. But these people still linked to the past had something authentic, yeah, to that. So Du Bois argues that the history of social life can be understood as a decline of being into having and having into emergently appearing. So this is, I think, where the critique comes to a new form of consuming society, yeah? Yeah, because what you could realize, I mean, in Europe it still is okay in a certain way, but if you're in the US, you would realize the way you look like is not because you want to look like this, it's because there is a representation that enforces you to look like this, yeah? I mean, sorry that I'm saying this to females here, yeah? In generally, but it's unbelievable what's happening in the US. It's to men the same thing, it doesn't matter, but the amount of styling, of makeup, or is unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. Yeah? Or the kind of whole manipulation of your appearance. Yeah, you know that you. I don't know. I don't know. Probably I'm not an expert in male. I guess it's. In a private life, I'm going to tell you once what people tell me when you have to go to a date with someone in the US, what they are going to tell you and ask you, yeah? So just know. I thought they are totally fucked up, you know? I tell you one thing, there's no wonder for me anymore, yeah? That this guy Trump, yeah? I mean, that the guy Trump is, have you seen him? The guy, have you seen this? He's sprayed in orange, you know? That is real. It's not anymore a fake, you know? It's not a clown. It's really, he thinks it looks good, you know? When he sprays himself into orange, yeah, it's a funny, but you know, it sounds that funny because it's true, because what they already arguing, you live the representation as the real, and that became our condition, yeah. And today it's not anymore a movie, it's not anymore an aesthetic culture, it is reality. It is the common. That's, I think, is the thing. So you could even blame them that they indicate, yeah? Anyway. So this historical commodity, in which commodity completes the colonization of social life. And that's the critique of that consumerism, yeah? So the spectacle is then not a collection of image for Du Bois, yeah, but rather it's a social relationship between people and that mediated by images, yeah? So you have to imagine this was already in the 60s, yeah? So in the 60s they already knew, yeah, what media culture and new forms of image culture is going to produce, yeah? So that's why Du Bois is arguing, and this is, I think, what has to be really understood also in relationship to Kohlhaas, why they were interested in surrealists, and why in principle today a new form of realism goes back again to surrealism, is because there was the idea that if I cannot change society, I can change it by faking a new society in it, but that fake society can be a constructed one, yeah? So the reason of these intellectuals was the belief that if I make up a story, yeah, like for example Kohlhaas, I tell a story about Manhattan, yeah, and bring it back into the reality, it becomes a new form of life. Well, the point is, and here you can see the danger, what was once an art practice becomes a political practice, becomes a social practice. Yeah? Now, that's why we are stuck, because, or this is why you realize if you do something strange today, it becomes a new normal. Yeah? This is, here. So it is the boring. Yeah? Anyhow. That's another story. But you see, I think I want to tell you this because you have to understand you come after that. Or basically you are living already in the consequence of that thesis, which is 50 years ago. Huh? Yeah. So that's now the more encouragement in the use of the term, which involves using spectacular images and languages to disrupt the flow of the spectacle. Yeah, it was, and here you also should understand, that was the idea to be critical. Meaning, I could be critical because I'm standing outside and I throw something in distance onto that. This is what have changed with us. How can you be critical if you are in yourself a product of that? Huh? This became then the whole problem of the within. So, and that's why, of course, it's a Marxist thing, the society of the spectacle, blah, blah, yeah? So when we come now to the Manhattan transcript, and I also show it to you because don't believe any architect who invented anything, okay, has just stolen or copied from an art practice before. Yeah? Yeah. Or actually, what you see in architecture is a 30 to 50 years delay that already happened in architecture. Yeah? I mean, modernism is a nice example. When architecture did modernism, you know, art did already surrealism. Yeah, just as an example. Yeah, yeah. Well, modern painting was already over. Yeah, yeah. So the Manhattan transcript, yeah, differs from, and here comes the principal story. Because in order now to do a project, yeah, in that time, it basically meant that rather than doing a real project, yeah, nor was it only a fantasy, but it was in principle an interpretation of reality. And so what the implication was, yeah, that he wanted nothing else to do to show that architecture can describe things normally removed from conventional architectural representation. And here come to the story why, for example, we had education in the 60s and 70s where people said, I'm going to dancing. You know, this is where I think a certain interest, I think, to Johann's work is because what happened now at that time is, in order to change architecture, I had to find representation in other means of disciplines, yeah, and see how they come back. And what is interesting to me in Tschumi, because Tschumi shows you, as a trained architect, what such a other representation means when it comes into art. So he had enough conventional education, yeah, so to show us how he did it. And I think it's really interesting to learn from that. Yeah. So what was that idea? He wanted to bring now several things together, which I think are more than just Kohlhaas. Which means on the one hand side, he wanted to make a relationship between space and their use, between the set and the script of that space, and between the type and the program. So all these dualisms, yeah, that were actually related to architecture, he wanted to somehow debate. Yeah? Okay? So what has he done? In principle, you could see that I would say the main argument that Tschumi has done is he reinterpreted the idea of what modernism understood as program or function. Yeah? So what he basically did is to say there is no such thing as a function or a program. What there is, and this is what you can see, there is an event, there are objects, and there are movement. And what is happening is every kind of program or function is in principle an interplay. Now look at us, you know, in a certain way, if there wouldn't be, for example, that screen, you know, as an object, yeah, in relationship to me holding a lecture as an event, yeah, there wouldn't be the pattern of organization of sitting, yeah. So for him it became a relational model. And and that's why I was asking you guys if you have been in his last lecture from last semester, because what I didn't know is Tschumi was really interested in actually an art practice at that time, yeah, which were art pieces where people were dancing around their objects. Yeah? So it was like a game-related art practice. So, but what you can see what Tschumi did in order now to tell his story, he had to invent a character in order to play this idea out. And that character is this guy with the dotted line, and that is the murder. Yeah? So he had to invent an irrational subject, the murder, that is basically like Freud, just is how do you say, triebgetrieben, has just, is not a rational subject, yeah, but is a, I don't know the English word, it's a Triebsubjekt. Huh? Trieb is a Triebobjekt, yeah? Which means he's driven by the desires to kill someone, yeah? So it's not a rational subject, it's basically a kind of, Of course they are all psychologically, I mean, look, but just know, for a psychoanalytic you also are crazy, yeah? We all are, yeah? There is no such thing as normal, yeah? Yeah? And believe me, as older you get, as more perverse people become. Eh? Because then they live out their real perverse. That's what people tell me. Okay. You see, there are only two nice periods of life, you know? When you start it and when you end it. And in between you just have to figure out to turn normal. Yeah? Actually, but in the beginning and the end you realize you are not. Yeah? You at this age should try to become normal. Yeah? Believe me, this is a devastating period. Yeah? Yeah? But after 50, you get happy again. Because then you skip your idealism. But now what Tschumi did is, not only that he did this, of course, as you can see, he made now a trick that people are using today as well. He used for the event each time a different form of representation. He used the image for the event. He used the plan, the building, and the spaces for the idea of the objects. And here comes Johann, the kind of idea of choreography, dancing, movement, and sport as an idea of movements. And why, of course, this whole book is also interesting, because not only did it have an idea about how to construct these relationships, but it was, he also invented new forms of notations. And if you see later on, some of the stuff that reoccurred in the 90s, you know, when the Deleuzian stuff appeared. Now, how did he do it? Now that's, I think, is interesting for the structure of the book. In order to apply now that idea of a thesis, he took very conventional urban typologies. So he was not saying, oh, I do not crazy stuff, you know, funky, crazy, like Libya's woods, you know, bird building. No, what he did now is he made, in principle, the study on 4 different typologies. One was the park, one was the tower, one was the block, and one was the street. Yeah? So he basically took 4 urban diagrams and told the story. Yeah? So here comes the first story, and it's all about the murder and the victim. Yeah? So this is the first story. So here you can see the story, the murderer is hunting the victim. Yeah? So here you also can see the reason why I show you this diagram is because the victim for Tschumi is the rational subject, you know, is us, and the murder is the irrational one. Yeah? Now, if you look at them in the relationship of space, it means the victim is using the constructed space by modernism. He goes on the street, goes there, yeah? But the murderer has to hunt. He goes in the bushes, goes behind, you know, just, you know, today if you do this is why, for example, people like Bob Sommer say, well, there's a city within the city, it's a city of the subculture. You know, the murder becomes replaced now by subculture, yeah? Or by James Bond movies, yeah? Things like that, yeah? Where you go with a motorbike, where usually people, yeah? So where you use or misuse, in principle, the urban fabric. Yeah? But in that case, it was the murder. And what you can see is that here you can see that he's always using these different spaces, and then the different geometries. Yeah? Then you can see after the movement, there starts a new kind of event, that suddenly the murderer kills the victim, yeah, as you can see. Then the idea of the trace comes there, the object that was once there but not anymore there, yeah. And so here you can see all the kind of the story, how it goes, and blah. So that means inscribed in this kind of techniques is suddenly that then there is a replacement, back to the image, that suddenly there is a void emerging because there's a mental void, yeah. Yeah, because then after a while they try to find the victim, and by reconstructing the victim there is a geographical, this is where it comes back to the psychogeographical one, where I wanted to show that there is a void, or as you can see there's only some leftovers, and then you can see already he tries to give this space, a circulation space, yeah, and then they reconstruct, and then there comes like notations in the game, yeah. Anyhow, so you could see what the idea was to understand how can I tell a story, yeah, of the murder and the victim and the reconstruction by replacing another form of notation than what usually is the plan and the section of modern planning. Yeah? Now the second story is the one on the street, or the idea of the border. Yeah? And this, of course, was then translated in such a way that the murderer escaped from prison, yeah, and was now hunted by the police along the street. Yeah? But what this is now interesting, first of all, as you can see, don't worry, in the 70s people were doing some strangely folded plan into section plan, you know what I mean? Like everyone wanted to make a plan related to a section. Yeah? As you can see, there is, on the global scale, you have the urban fabric, then you have the border, but in that border we're flipping the sections. I don't know if you see this. Do you see this? No, you don't, huh? You don't? Okay. Okay. So these lines are representing the urban fabric. That line is a section out of that urban fabric on which I tell the story. So this is still a plan. But then what I do is that plan gets folded into an elevation, into an image, okay? Yeah. Yeah, today you don't do this, you do super animation stuff, yeah? Yeah. So here you can see, but what he wanted to do is something different. When the first negotiation was something which was in plan, here he wanted to change the idea of the boundary. And so here you can see in all these notions is, how does the murder go inside the building, change the topology of the building, so here you can see that each time the topology of the section has to do something with the thing of, you see, and so funny enough, when I saw this, sometimes these images, you can see he was not only interested in abstract forms of movement. Many of the movements had to do with the organization of the plan. Yeah, yeah. But there was always the idea of a trace, or an always in the. I mean, if I saw recently for 2 days ago a seminar, a project by Eric Owen Moss, yeah, and you would still see the idea of constructing a murder or a path, yeah, as a design device. Yeah. So that means what you design is suddenly a sequence of these events, for example. Okay, here goes. Now these are some examples. Then I think the next one is the tower. Yeah? But here, with the tower, he uses another technique. And here you can see he does it the following. Because Tschumi didn't have an idea in that time, how do I represent, yeah, a space that belongs to a movement, but rather than to a given form. Yeah? And so what he came up with is an idea which I would call the idea of extrusion, yeah? Or the idea of carving out. Yeah? So just to understand the sequence of the drawings, I mean, at least to my knowledge, I try to understand it. In the tower, he wanted to show that in different, the program, so each of them things you understand were always the same. It was the relationship between modernist planning and the murder. So in the park, it was the grid. In the street, it was the urban fabric of Manhattan. And here in the tower, it's the organization of the slabs and the different organization of plans. Yeah? So here, for example, this is also why when you meet people, let's say postmodernists, you're not allowed to do rectangular things because they wanted to kill the rational. I mean, if you look at Liebes Woods, you will always find on the background of Liebes Woods a grid, yeah, which was then, that's what has to be distorted, yeah. So that's why I'm saying it goes through the whole generation of these people, yeah. So what Tschumi now did is, the first one is basically showing a layout, yeah. For example, in this case, it was a hotel or a asylum, yeah. Then he shows in a third diagram a movement. Then he shows how that movement has an effect on the organization of that plan, and then you see a redistribution of that plan. Yeah? So that means first you see the organization, then the movement comes in, and the movement then has an effect of reorganizing or designing the space. Yeah? So as you can see here, it's not about constructing an event, it's about designing another form of relationship of elements that trigger another form of movement. Yeah? And he does it now. So this was the first one with a corridor building. So this would be the corridor typology. Then this one will be the room into room typology. This is interesting. You see where he says every space is an individual space, and then he comes in and gives every one of these individual spaces at home a different event. Yeah. And also he says if the first one is about a home with different spaces, then he gives that home each time a different event. Yeah. And that's why the character of each of the spaces is changing. But as you can see, for Tschumi, he didn't know how to represent it. So what you can see when you see the movement, so the movement became literally a translation of the space. And you will see later on, yeah, he wanted just to make a difference between, and imagine now to our situation here, if Tschumi would make a representation, yeah, in that technique to our place, if the four walls are the rational subject, yeah, but the relationship between us together is the event, then he would trace more or less a boundary onto us, and that subtracted from the rational box is for him the event. Yeah? So he didn't know how to represent it differently, yeah, at that time. Yeah, and then the next thing is, how do you then make a hybrid between home, office, hotel, asylum, and so on? And so then the murder is falling down. So here comes the murder falls down. I mean, there's a lot of metaphor in it, but he wanted to do with the murder who falls down, generate this other kind of space that carves through, and anyhow, okay? And the last one is then the block. Now, what is now interesting, and I think I tried to now summarize it, in the first 3 chapters of the book, and if you're really interested in, yeah, sometimes I forgot it, but in the first 3 chapters, and I show you them, I just found it because I have it here with me, but that you understand what I mean. What now becomes interesting in the end of the book, yeah, is where he wanted to show what kind of détournements are possible. What kind of, how do you say, Zweckentfremdung, or which kind of détournements, yeah, are possible within architecture in the relationship of object, movement, and so on. Yeah? And to just be clear, what I mean is when you look at Tschumi's text, and I can only recommend it if you want, I can give it to you. It's usually people only look at Tschumi's images, but there is in principle in the beginning of the book, what is it, Delirious New York, megastructure, Manhattan. There is, you see, if you go in the very first pictures, there is a text which explains the diagrams. And I have to honestly say, because only once you understand the diagram, the text, you might have a relationship what you mean to understand it. Because first of all, and here, I think here it goes. So here goes, and so here that you understand, these are the 5 things that you should be interested in, because he's now going to explain. Yeah? Oh. Okay, the means doesn't work. Okay, don't worry. Okay. Okay, we will explain it like this. Okay, okay. So, here goes. So what now Tschumi does in the end is trying to argue how can now different kind of events take place, but not only this, how can now different kind of sequence of events take place. And here you should see why it means now, when I'm going to ask you how are you going to design about Tschumi, yeah? It is not just making things next to each other. For Tschumi there is an idea about the organization of events according to an idea of sequence. Yeah? And you will see later on in the Bhakti Labillet, there is a sequential also understanding of events. So here comes this idea. If you have, and this, so here you understand, so if you have again an object, if this is the event, if this is basically the movement, yeah, and this is the object, yeah, so if this object, movement, and event, then you could argue that you can have different kind of objects, for example, a bridge, a facade, whatever. You could have different kind of movements. Yeah? You can have a linear movement, a circular movement, a dancing movement, and so on. Or you can have different events, acrobatic, ice skating, and so on. And what Tschumi now does is he shows you what could become something else. Yeah? And here, for example, one of his questions is, I could make an insertive sequence. Insertive sequence means I have the same object, but I apply each time a different kind of event. Yeah? Yeah? And so here he basically summarized it in a quite nice way. He said, what modernism did is making functional or homogeneous relationships, yeah? Which was, if this is my architectural element, okay, call it bridge, then my movement is going from one side to the other side, and my event is basically an event that tangles along the movement. So he would say what functionalism did in modernism is basically making movement, event, and objects coherent to each other, or he called homogeneous. Then he says what postmodernism, I think, or what the détournement is to say I'm making heterogeneous relationships. So for example, I have a bridge, but then on the bridge I put on a movement, an event that is, for example, dancing, and I operate that one with an event which is, for example, a game. So I make a place in disjunction to that what actually its function is, yeah? And therefore I change the function of the object as such. Now, and the last thing is the one which he calls the post-structuralist one. Imagine movement becomes object, object becomes event, event becomes movement. Yeah? And this is basically what I would call then the diagramming of the 90s. Yeah? I take an image from somewhere and turn it into another image. Yeah? I take a Lebra pattern and turn it into, I don't know, a functional diagram for the program. You know, this becomes then the post-structuralist idea, which means I can take anything to become anything else. Yeah? That's what you're doing right now. Just to know. Just to know. The only reason why I show you this stuff because I think there are not many things that we have, that the discourse is in a moment doing, that really has moved beyond that. At least beyond the techniques of post-structuralism. Because the Deleuzian moment was not different than that. It just gave it a different geometry, yeah? Or basically made an object for which the event is unpredictable and blah, blah, blah. Yeah? But I mean, that was the course. So, And why this is interesting is because you see, once you understand that you translate space into movement, events, and objects, I think this, I have to say, this is one of the most beautiful diagrams that I found, where you could see how the idea of détournement and estrangement, people today would call it estrangement, would take place. Yeah? So, and here, this is, I think this is what the book then goes on. It shows, for example, how does a sort of an insertive sequence look like. But what is really interesting, because you see in Tschumi's case, he made the notation become a space. Yeah? So why I think he was still a literally architect, even when he was doing in between spaces, he wanted to find another form of representation where space is still visible as an empty space, but that space is visible based on a certain pattern. I don't know, I'm so sure you saw once a thesis where someone made a dancing movement and then you envelope around that movement and carve it out. Just no. Yeah. So then you have this is a disjunctive, disjunctive sequence. So here you can see I take an architectural object, replace it with a different event, yeah? And then I have a distorted sequence. Well, I wish you the best, yeah? You can go once in it. I think I'm still amazed, 91. He must have had some really funky drawing techniques, yeah? Because there was no computer how he's doing this distortion diagrams. Yeah. And this goes on, you see, in the end, and so you could see in the end that turns out the whole idea of collage techniques, because in order to represent all that thing, it was nothing else as trying to resemble this different element. But what is funny is, even when you see some of them as architectural references, you suddenly see volumes as diagrammatic references, yeah, and things like this. So you could argue at the same time that the last transcript eliminated all that is essential to architecture and the city. You know, space, movement, and events are constructed into one single fragment, absolute necessity to the outline of the overall structure. Yeah? And so, since each frame is isolated from the next, architecture can begin to act as a series of surprises, yeah? A form of architectural jump cuts where a space is carefully broken apart and then reassembled to its limits. So, in principle, differently to the idea of Kohlhaas, it was not only about programming as such and hoping an event takes place. For him, it was really about the sequential of events, cutting them, breaking them. Even when in Kohlhaas you understand the idea of the boundary as a cut, here it was a cut. Now, why I'm showing that is, and why it later on became the idea of deconstructivism, and this is, I'm just adding this, is because that one diagram that he was using, yeah, where he said this is a post-structuralist thing, everyone can become everything, yeah, of course was in relationship to this idea that the détournement has of course to do with the idea of the signifier and the signified of element, because in the end what really the détournement did is I take a bottle that is a form and has a signifier, and I put it into another context. What I do is basically I change the meaning, and therefore it becomes a different signifier. So the reason why language thesis became important for that moment is because the détournement, meaning to replace something into a new context and changing its meaning, is something that they learned from post-structuralist theorists. Yeah? And so that's why, as a summary, I just want to show you the difference between some of the characters that for you might seem to sound similar, but have each time a different intention. Yeah? Is this idea, what is the sign and what is the symbol and what is the physical and the signifier one. So if you think now about Eisenmann, in order to understand, for him it's very clear, he takes the signifier away, yeah, and keeps only the form, yeah, and therefore doesn't replace it, but just makes it a male function of the form as such. Yeah? So this is the famous example of the column. Yeah? So he takes it keeps the sign of the column alive, but not the function of the column. Therefore, you have suddenly a hanging column, yeah? Doesn't function as a column anymore, but it's only the sign of a column, yeah? Or, for example, it's a column on the stair, meaning it dysfunctions suddenly the stair, yeah? Or it makes the stair to dysfunction something else, yeah? Or this is what he, for example, did in the house 3. What he wanted to really find out in the houses is, if I select and cut the house, how long do I have to do this process in order for one architectural element making another one dysfunction? Yeah? Now, in Tschumi, you could suddenly see why he, for example, would translate every kind of programming into, in principle, these 3 layers, yeah, of circulation, program, and events, because for him, this overlap of the 3 different programming start to trigger basically his kind of sequences of spaces. So that's why, for example, the first part is the movement part, which he translates into circulation. The last part is programming, and that's why the Foleys become the event ones, yeah? Because this is the ones that he didn't have. And so you can see when you look in the drawings that he did for the Parc de la Villette, that in this kind of arrangement, you know, there would kind of new patterns and this adjunctive relationship happen. Now, the most interesting to me is also this idea of the Foley, because if you look at the Foley, I think he does to the Foley the same what he does generally to the other objects, yeah? And I show you later on, because if you look at this very exactly, if you here, if you look at these Foleys, for example, here's one. In principle, these Foleys are nothing else as modernist Le Corbusier houses. You have the structure of the column, you have the floor plate, yeah, and you have the facade, yeah. And in principle, the physical element, the element of the program, and the element of the events are given. And by de-assembling now these elements and rearranging them, he's hoping, yeah, that other forms of event can take place. I'm not sure if this is right, but this is my conclusion, and I will show you later on when I show you some of the Foleys, when he places the staircase out of the building, yeah, or the things like this. So that's why, if you, one of the famous examples of Tschumis, yeah, is, for example, now this art center, Fresnoy in Paris. Now, in order now to design that idea of détournement and hopefully to triggering a different event, he takes now 2 of these things from the Situationist very literally. What he does is, this is a former's factory, and so as you can see, what he does is he puts a roof onto it and produces suddenly an in-between space, yeah? And if you look now in this in-between space, he makes all the circulation. So what happens now is, what before was an entrance on the bottom becomes an entrance on the roof, yeah? And so therefore, because the object became differently related to the program, suddenly he was hoping that a different event can take place, yeah? And so I think that is what this idea is of the in-between, because on the street events are foreseen, but on that roof you suddenly, and you see then, you enter then on the side and things like this. So finally, you know, it could be stressed or implied what he calls a programmatic violence of the transcript. Is there, to a question of past humanist program, they strictly covered only functional requirements necessary for survival and production, and in favor to those activities generally considered negative or unproductive, meaning luxury, mounting, wars, cult, games, spectacles, arts, perversive sexual activities. Sex for the 68 was always there, always. Yeah? And so that was the idea. The idea was, with that kind of architecture, or with that kind of détournement and that kind of replacement, they were hoping to generate a reconstruction of the social life that was sort of basically, I would say, repressed by modern rational thinking. Yeah? And that's why all of these people went to their psychoanalytics, that's why they go to their shrink, how do you call it in English? Shrine or shrink? Okay. So here is a summary. I think this is something what I haven't found, but it would be nice to even hold a lecture once, because I think Tschumi has, as a summary, quite a nice lecture where he makes some really nice definition. So what, for example, is a space? A space, is a content, a category of consciousness, a pure form, or rather a social product or a production of a social political structure. What is movement? Movement is an action or a process of moving, particular act of manner. What is an event? An event is then for him an incident, an occurrence, a particular item in a program, compress particular uses, singularities, function. And so what it is for him now, a program in that sense, is now suddenly a combination of events, movement, and so on. And so when he then looked into architecture, what he really became interested is not anymore, how the formalist would understand it as a figure ground plan, or Collage would understand it as a pure idea of Miesian emptiness. He would look then into the idea of sequence, And I think this is where you can see, I think this was his lecture series. I don't know, I never found it, but I heard that there is a lecture series of Tschumi, where he would show architectural examples and how, for example, this is a nice example of the Dublin Tower, where you see, for example, here the second version is, I think, Ramses II Egyptian plan, where you see suddenly a sequence of that spaces. And of course, what became very famous is then later on, in order to show these spaces, he came up with new notational techniques, which he did from the dancing stuff, and basically turned this thing into a kind of a device or an action and so on. I don't know why I still have slides here, but I guess this was just something I never finished. That's it. Thank you very much.